Where were you on January 28th, 1986, the date of the Challenger disaster?
I was probably at my house, so to speak, in the Central Highlands of Kenya, where I was serving as a Peace Corps volunteer.
All right. What exactly were you doing, and where were you when you heard of this incident for the first time?
Well, I actually didn't hear about the incident for the first time until approximately 2 weeks later, and you might find that surprising, but where I lived, you didn't have newspapers, you didn't have TV, you didn't even have radio. And so I literally didn't find out about it until I was sitting on a local bus going from one place to another locally, and a well-dressed African gentleman said, "What do you think of your spaceship crashing?" I'm like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a 2-week-old newspaper that I hadn't seen a newspaper in 2 weeks, and showed me the headline and the famous picture of the Challenger exploding. And that was the first time I ever found out about it. So probably sometime early to mid-February.
What were your first thoughts regarding this accident? First thoughts that ran through your head?
I was like, wow. Because being in Kenya at the time and being out of the mainstream news and what was happening in the world, I was only really peripherally aware that there was even the Challenger going up. But when he said it, I was shocked, and especially the irony of not knowing about it for a couple of weeks, and then having an African gentleman ask me about my spaceship. And that's, I believe, how he phrases, "What do you think of your spaceship?" as if I owned it as an American. So I was really kind of shocked, both because of the circumstances and, of course, because of the tragedy.
What were the impacts on you where you were living at the time?
Probably very minimal. Like I said, we didn't get a lot of news, about things that were happening in the world. A lot of the people around there really didn't have the awareness either. A lot of natives, people who didn't even speak English weren't even aware very much of the United States. So the fact that this obviously educated African gentleman, who I didn't know even, brought it up to me, he was probably one of the only local people who would have even had the awareness to bring it up to me.
Where you lived, did people care about this event on the other side of the world?
I think it's not that they didn't care. I think people in Africa, when I was there, 22 years ago, really did care what was happening in America, and they cared about Americans. Americans were actually very popular in a way, the kind of the envy, everything stuff, which was very beneficial to what I was doing. I got a lot of attention for it, but I don't think most of them really had a perspective. I know most of my students really weren't aware of it because they didn't read the newspapers up there any more than I did.
How big do you think was this event's international importance?
I think any time that there's something like that, space travel carries so much importance to people all around the world, and it always has since Sputnik and Gemini and everything, with the United States and Russia. And the few times that there has been a tragedy in space, it takes on just a huge specter. And fortunately, there's been so few of them. But I think anytime you have that in space, as opposed to any other thing, maybe militarily or civilian, it just is so much bigger and so many more people feel it. And then, of course, with the people that were on it, I think also helped with that impact.
What image comes to mind when you think of the Challenger?
I think my image, and I haven't really seen much of the news play because I had no access to see it on TV, is the famous picture of it exploding. Because I said I've seen very few, maybe 2 or 3 times in the 22 years since, actually the film of it as it going up. So that newsprint, famous picture is the thing that I remember.
What is your understanding of what went wrong with the spacecraft?
I'm not really sure. I remember something to do with fuel leakage and stuff like that. All I know is there was a big explosion, and they talk about rocket science and everything, and my knowledge of rocket science is very small. So all I know is there was a big explosion that wasn't supposed to happen. I'm sure it had to do with vast quantities of fuel.
Do you think enough has been done to keep the memory of the Challenger disaster alive? Why or why not?
I think there's no doubt. I know there's been, the movies and the celebrations of anniversaries, and obviously we're talking about it now, and young people your age are being educated about it. And I don't think I mentioned earlier about how the space disasters take on larger than real life specters in history, and I think the Challenger has certainly taken its place along some of the other space disasters and successes, I might add.
What do you think the impact has been on NASA and/or worldwide space exploration?
I think the Challenger, space exploration at that point in history, with with the moon, of course, being done, and all the Mars and beyond being non-manned, I think kind of the story of space in the last 20, 25 years, or certainly since Challenger, figuring out what man's role in traveling in space is, and I think that this had that kind of focused still on some of the dangers and things that were still inherent in just very basic space travel. Things that maybe I think NASA has struggled to this day to address.
What are your thoughts of the media coverage of the Challenger accident?
I'm probably not very well qualified to say that, since my access to the media coverage was so limited, being on the other side of the world and where I was. So I really am not qualified to address that. It was good enough so that African gentleman in the Rift Valley escarpment in Kenya knew about it and seemed to be educated about it. So it was obviously a worldwide event.
What are your personal emotions towards the incident?
I think anytime you have a tragedy like that, you feel for the people involved. I think that also in something like that, everybody goes in open-eyed about the potential for disaster. Just like any time an Air Force pilot steps out into an F-16, that's part of the equation. It's part of what the people are trained for that are on it. So, it's certainly a disaster for them and their families, and a tragedy. And I feel for them that. But that's part of the danger of doing things like that.
What contemporary event do you think is most comparable to the Challenger disaster?
Well, I think the other, and I'm probably the other disaster with a space shuttle where it blew up re-entering with the panels that came off, I would think is the comparable one. I think the Challenger, maybe because it was the first time it happened, or it happened in such a more spectacular way, and I don't even remember. You can refresh me on the name. The Columbia. I think that was it disappeared, but this one was on takeoff, and it was so spectacular and so visual and it was also the first one that the Challenger has sort of superseded the Columbia, but I think that's the natural one to compare it to.
What is the most recent event regarding the Challenger that you can remember, whether it be news coverage, memorials, etc.?
I think on the 20th anniversary, especially, her name was Christine McAuliffe. Was that the lady on the Challenger? I believe so. I think when they were on the 20th anniversary of it, there was a lot of, especially the recognition of the McAuliffe, the teacher who was on the flight, and sort of celebrating and bringing that back into history and perspective, especially with her role in it being a civilian, a teacher going up into space. And I seem to remember there being a lot of recognition of that.
Do you think there's a moral to the Challenger disaster story?
I think the lesson to be learned, and maybe it's not a moral, is that when you're doing things like this, when you're reaching new boundaries, when you're going into space, new technologies, there's a danger involved. And part of the risk and danger is that there are going to be people who lose their lives, whose lives are going to be profoundly affected by it. But that's I think, inherent in the risk of any time you're reaching out. And definitely space travel for mankind is reaching out.
How much of today's youth do you think are aware of this event? And why not do you think this is important?
I don't think, youth, I think in the schools, there are things that they study a lot more than current history. Maybe I'm not well qualified to say that, not being in school now, but in order to stay up on current events, and I think something 22 years ago is very much current. I don't know whether there's as much emphasis in the school system and in society of studying and paying attention to recent events and how they tie into present day decision making and stuff. I think history will look back on it and it will be important, just like the Apollos and everything like that were important back in the 60s and stuff, which is farther back, and I think we have a historical perspective on that. I think it's still current enough that a lot of the younger people today really don't have that historical grasp on it.
How did this event change your thoughts about space programs?
It really didn't. change them at all, my thoughts. I've always thought that space exploration, whether it be manned shuttle, whether it be to the moon, whether it to be reaching out on probes to the outer limits of the universe, they're things that we as mankind need to do. I think there's so many benefits from it that go beyond just knowing what's the surface of Jupiter or Mars is like. There's so many benefits technologically, and I think psychologically even. To space travel and reaching out, it's not too much different than pioneers coming across the Atlantic Ocean in search of America 600 years ago or 500 years ago. Mankind needs to keep reaching out. I think things like that are just little bumps in the road that you learn from, you get historical perspective from, but they're very important things in the big picture of space exploration.
Why is it important for people to know about the Challenger?
I think just because it's an important part of history. It puts things in perspective. Sometimes it takes a disaster or a problem to get people to pay attention to history. If there weren't car crashes in NASCAR, people wouldn't pay as much attention or something like that. But you need something to bring historically to bring perspective to it. And if you have 50 shuttle missions that go perfectly, and there's great things being done, scientific progress, technological progress, new discoveries, that's great, but people don't tend to get involved in that. And sometimes I think just by the nature of people, they need something, usually unfortunately a disaster, to bring their attention to something and put historical perspective to it.
What were you doing in the Peace Corps in Kenya at this time?
I was a teacher, high school level teacher at a small Harambee school on the Rift Valley Escarpment. Harambee School is a community-run school, not a public school, so it's a poor school. This was a very rural part of the country, no electricity, no running water, dirt roads and everything like that. And I was teaching a high school group for 2 years. And I said it was exciting because it was out in the middle of nowhere. You didn't get news for a long time. So when you actually went down to civilization, and I remember the first thing I would always do is get 3 newspapers. They had 3 newspapers in Kenya, and I'd buy every newspaper so I could catch up on news like this. And I guess I hadn't been down to civilization in a couple of weeks when the Challenger went down, probably because it was January 28th, so probably right after New Year's, a new school term starting. And so for the first month or so, you're going hard and heavy at school, and you don't want to be, running off or anything like that for a weekend. So that probably accounts for why I didn't know about it. But that's what I was doing, teaching, African kids in an African high school, and loving every minute of it.